about your devices if that's what you prefer. And I'll let you turn to 1 John chapter 3, starting at verse 11 and going to verse 18. So I'll just give you a moment to grab that. All right, 1 John 3, verse 11. For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth.
Hi, I'm Isabel, and our second Bible reading today is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. So, chapter 2, starting at verse 1. For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God, who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory.
Thanks, Iz. Good evening, everyone. James is my name. Great to see you. And on behalf of Nick and Anna, who got married yesterday, a big thank you for those of you who have supported them and watched online and all that kind of thing. If you know them, they have feelings and they're very upset that not everyone can be here and all that kind of stuff. So on their behalf, thank you for your support and encouragement of them. Now, there are two types of people in this world. I'm sure you know this. There are people who like summer and there are people like winter. It's time to own up to that. And so people who like summer, hands up. People like winter. Okay, I'm going to change your mind. That is, if you ever went to Adelaide in winter, you would realise that it is the coldest place in the world. Worse than Siberia, worse than Antarctica. In Adelaide in winter, like, it's cold and dark, it rains the whole time, the clouds are kind of about 1/4 millimetre above your head, you're just so depressed the whole time, it's just awful. And so, as you may know, we lived there for 10 years, and after one particularly dark, cold winter, we saved up all our monies and went to Queensland for 5 days. It was a disaster, actually. That is, we had 6 children under the age of 8 in a 3-bedroom apartment that had paper-thin walls, and so we were highly anxious about upsetting everyone in the apartment around us. Not only that, but no one had told us or given us a memo that in Queensland, the sun actually rises at 4 a.m. They don't believe in daylight savings, and so we had 6 children running around 4 a.m. By 9 a.m, we'd had 3 meals and we're ready for bed. And Karen and I just came home absolutely exhausted. The strange thing is that even to this day, some of the kids go, "Oh, that was the best holiday we ever had." I go, "Are you kidding me? Like, on what basis do you make that judgment?" They said, "Well, the apartment block had like 3 swimming pools. And like having breakfast all day long was like the best thing ever." When you come to this letter of 1 Thessalonians, it's as if there's kind of those completely different perspectives. On the one hand, you look at Paul's mission to Thessalonica and think it was an utter failure. He came in, preached the gospel, caused so much trouble that he had to, or decided to leave 3 weeks later. Utter failure. But look at what he says in chapter 2, verse 1. Please open your Bibles or devices if you haven't done that already. Chapter 2, verse 1. He says, you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. It was not a failure, is what he's saying. You can't look at the trip we had, the mission we had, the ministry we did among you and think failure. You can't come to that conclusion. There's a different perspective that you need to have. And you kind of go, really? Like, what possible indicator of success is there? Like, I've read church planning manuals. None of them say, stick around for 3 weeks, that's all you need to do. Like, you've got to do better than that. And Paul says, no. What I patterned for you was actually healthy ministry. And it's interesting, just scan through those first 12 verses in chapter 2 and see if you can pick up the key word or key words. I wonder if you see it. Every couple of verses he says something like, you know, or you remember. Verse 1, you yourselves know that our trip was not in vain. Verse 2, you know that we had boldness. Verse 5, you know that we didn't come with flattery. Verse 9, you remember we worked hard among you. Verse 10, you witnessed how holy we were. Verse 11, you know how we were like a father with his children. It's a strange way to speak, isn't it? It almost reads a little bit defensively, like, what are you trying to prove? What are you trying to sell? Like, what's the deal here? Aussies don't like people big noting themselves and kind of go, what's going on here, Paul? Are you trying to tell us how good you are? Or like, no, that's not the case. So, but what is the purpose of these 12 verses as he moves from what we saw last week when he talked about them and how they were the model church? They had the model response to the gospel as they turned from idols to the living God to serve him and wait for Jesus. That was them, the model church. He then turns right around and looks at things from his perspective. What ministry was like for him. Why does he do that? We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's look first of all at what he does say with the marks of healthy ministry. Here's the outline for you. If you're jotting down some notes, what does healthy ministry look like? Here's what Paul says. I spoke the gospel. I suffered for the gospel. I sought to please God, not people. And I served with love and gentleness. First of all then, I spoke the gospel. For Paul, that the gospel was preached is the first and most significant sign of health. And I know this sounds like kind of obvious, but for this city of Thessalonica, they had never heard the gospel. They had never heard of Jesus. And this news transformed the whole city. And so he says over and over again, this was just the best thing we could ever do. Verse 2, we declared the gospel to you. Verse 3, we made an appeal to you. Verse 4, because we were entrusted with the gospel we speak. Verse 8, we shared the gospel with you. Verse 9, we proclaimed the gospel to you. These 3 short weeks I had with you were a model of healthy ministry. Why? Because I had the opportunity to preach the gospel. whatever the context, whatever the circumstances, whatever the consequences, healthy ministry ensures that the gospel is proclaimed. That the amazing news of Jesus is shared with people. Now that might be surprising because as you've tried to kind of nervously talk about Jesus with your family or friends, they haven't been overwhelmingly positive at your attempts. And I just want to remind you that's not particularly surprising. I mean, think about it for a second. If you're a Christian, what you're saying to them is, there was this guy who was crucified as a criminal 2,000 years ago, and then claims to have risen from the dead, and I'm going to do what he says. It's an extraordinary way to live your life. It's extraordinary to say that, yeah, he's the one. He's the one I follow. He's the one I turn my life upside down for. It's no wonder that we don't win popularity contests. It's no wonder that when people hear the gospel, they sometimes just want to shut us down or laugh or sneer. But Paul isn't concerned here with the response to the gospel. He doesn't come to the Thessalonians until chapter 2, verse 13. Here it's just the gospel goes out. That's the first indicator of healthy ministry. Again, I know this is kind of basic. The difficulty is we so easily forget it. Or we can put our resources and time and energy somewhere else. I caught up with a family who visited a church recently, and I said, "What are you looking for?" And they said, "We want to bring our children to a place where they get good values." Which kind of led to this awkward conversation where I said, "Look, to be honest, that's just not our deal. We will do everything we can to help your kids grapple with Jesus and who he is and what he's done. And there may well be some consequences in terms of ethics and decisions you make, but that's not what we're on about. That's not our priority. We don't want to produce nice people. We want to talk about Jesus. The very best thing that we can do here at Matthias this year is to introduce people to Jesus, to point each other to Jesus. Now, part of the reason we worked hard at a strategic plan 2 or 3 years ago now was to better reflect this priority. That is, we worked out we were doing lots of good things, lots of good ministry, but there wasn't much of it that was driven towards helping people hear about Jesus who hadn't heard about Jesus before. That is, like any organisation, you can kind of have this thing called mission drift. You just drift away from your core mission. And so we wanted to deliberately rethink that. And you know that our vision is trying to capture that. That is, what do we want to do? Who do we want to be? We want to be people transformed by the gospel, transformed by the gospel of grace, maturing in faith, and proclaiming the gospel wherever we are. One of our 4 key portfolios you see there is reach. We want to reach out to our community with the gospel. We want Dave and Joe and others to spend lots of time thinking about how best can we do that. Or starting new churches, or supporting the Morbellis down at Wallara, or whatever it is. How do we get the good news out? Whatever the context, whatever the response, whatever the circumstance. Some of you will know that Joe's wife Shuva was due to give birth to a baby this week, and I get pretty anxious about these things, to be honest, and so I was pretty close to my phone all day on Thursday and Friday. Finally, a message came through from Joe. I think, thank goodness. I pray this is good news. It wasn't. Well, it was. But he said, I just wanted to let you know that Shuva's just been telling her midwife, as she's in labour, about the gospel of Jesus. I said, Joe, I don't want to hear about this. Which, of course, was the wrong response. whatever the context, whatever the circumstances. And she had a baby. Look, there he is. He's called Ethan, which was not my choice. Joe and Shuva made that choice all on their own. Ethan Harricks and Ethan Grimmett are particularly pleased, but there he is. And so why don't you congratulate Joe? Shuva's not here, but give him a congratulations. Whatever the context, we want to talk about Jesus. That's what Paul says. Second thing he says is this: I suffered for the gospel. Which is strange when you say, what's healthy ministry look like? And Paul says, I suffer. I suffer. Look down there at verse 2. We suffered in Philippi, and then we came to Thessalonica in the midst of much conflict. And then you kind of, if you remember reading through Acts 17 last week, you saw the conflict just kind of kept going. And so Jason and all his buddies who became Christians, they got kind of beaten up as well. Makes you think, why is suffering there? Like, why does suffering go hand in hand with talking about Jesus? I mean, there could be any number of reasons. Some of us are probably just a bit too aggressive or offensive. That's not Paul. He's deliberately gentle with them, he says. So why is there suffering? Go back to Acts 17, and it's worth reading again if you haven't yet. Acts 17 makes it very clear as to what the offence is. That is, the gospel they proclaimed was that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the King, which means that no one else is. And so in their context, that they took great offence that Caesar was not given the authority they thought he should have had. These Christians said, Jesus has all authority. And so this mob came together to beat them up. But think again about their model response. Heath, good to see you. We just talked about you behind your back. Think about their response. They turned from idols to serve the living and true God. It's not just a case of saying yes to Jesus. Coming to Christ, grappling with who he is, means saying no to everyone and everything else, whether it's Caesar or someone or something else. That is, coming to faith in Jesus isn't just like getting an insurance policy. I'll just go about my normal life knowing that if something goes wrong, at least I can kind of fall back on Jesus. No one else has a claim on your life. And there will be a cost. I can't keep bowing down to the gods of beauty or money or success. Saying yes to Jesus means saying no to others. I mentioned before the wedding service yesterday for Nick and Anna, and it's interesting you see this kind of language used in a wedding service. Like, we think of weddings as really positive and, it's just two people coming together and yada, yada, yada. And it is. It's really positive. But saying yes to Nick or saying yes to Anna means that they're actually saying no to anyone else. It's in the promise that they make to each other. Forsaking all others, love and protect, as long as you both shall live. I didn't get to do the sermon in the wedding yesterday, so I'm going to do it now instead. But you see the point. Saying yes to one person means saying no to everyone else. I may have all sorts of fleeting feelings or fantasies about someone else, but I'm not going to go there because I've said yes to you. I've made promises to you. So why does Paul do it? Why does he keep going from town to town, from city to city, putting himself in a position where he knows there's going to be trouble, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be suffering? Why does he do it? Have a look at the next section. I sought to please God, not people. If you've had a little snooze, let me just tell you where we're up to. We're trying to think about what healthy ministry looks like. And one of the difficulties that we've got in 1 Thessalonians is that Paul's ministry kind of looks like a failure. He was there for, 3 or 4 weeks and then disappeared. And Paul's saying, no, there's a different perspective. My ministry was healthy. This was a successful mission. And his justification for that was that he had the opportunity to preach the gospel, he suffered for the gospel, and thirdly, that he seeks to please God. Look down at verse 3. You see that verse 3 starts with the word for, F-O-R, which always gives us the reason. It's an important word in the Bible, and particularly here. Tells us the reason why this ministry is healthy. Verse 3 again, his appeal doesn't spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive. Rather, he speaks not to please people, but to please God. He speaks, if you like, with the audience of one person in mind. Why am I preaching the gospel? To please God, not people. I preach the gospel thinking of the one who matters, thinking of the one who judges the living and the dead. He's the one whose opinion matters. Here's my question for you to reflect on. How do you know if you're seeking to please God or please people? I think many of us struggle with this, actually. Am I a people pleaser or am I seeking to please God? I think the key is this: to think through, how will I react if they're negative? How will I react if they're very positive to the gospel? That is, if they're very positive to the gospel and I'm kind of proud, maybe there's a problem. If they're very negative to the gospel and I beat myself up, am utterly devastated because I think I did a bad job, there might be a problem, actually. Who am I seeking to please? Is my focus on serving God faithfully, whatever response I get? Because He's the one who saves. The final thing Paul says is, I served with love and gentleness. Have a look down there at verse 7 and 8. We were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. Again, you can imagine people saying, Paul, he was just here today, gone tomorrow. He's just a first century version of a televangelist. He just wants your money. He had 3 good sermons, didn't have anything else, and so it's just racked off. Paul says that's not true, and you know that's not true. You know that's not true. You know I shared my very life with you, not just the gospel. I laboured hard among you because I love you. You weren't just kind of fodder for my favourite sermons or my next project. I was affectionately desirous of you. You become very dear to us. We didn't just share the gospel with you, but our lives as well. So look down there, verse 6, he said, as an apostle, I could have made demands on you. I could have actually raised funds. But I know that sometimes money gets in the way of relationships, so I didn't do that. In my spare time, I stitched together tents so that I could earn a living. I didn't want money to get in the way or be a distraction. I worked hard. Again, he says, you know how I lived. You know how I was among you. Verse 10, I lived with a holiness in conduct. He uses the image of the mother and the father, the self-sacrificial mother, the father who encourages, exhorts, charges his children. Ministry is not done in some kind of laboratory with kind of everything's controlled. Ministry is done in the context of mess, messy lives, and it's hard work. If you see James or John posting photos of them down at the beach all week, you know they've missed the memo. Because they should be learning that ministry is hard work. Of course they are, you know that. It's labour. It's a labour of love as we serve those. And you know that's true for you as you serve one another. Sometimes it's hard. Come back to the question I asked earlier. Why does Paul write like this? Why does Paul write in this very un-Australian way of kind of almost sounding like he's big noting himself? I did this, and you know I did this, and you know I did this. I mean, he wasn't Australian as far as I can tell. But why did he write like this? I want to give you a minority report, and I want you to know it's a minority report because I could be wrong. Most people will say Paul speaks like this because it's a kind of classic Pauline defence. That is, we've looked at 1 Corinthians recently, and we know that he does this kind of defence. People in Corinth were saying, he's no good, and Paul's saying, oh, I am good, it's okay. Is that what Paul's doing here in Thessalonica? Most people say, yes, he was. I just don't think it fits. I don't think it fits the purpose of the letter. See, this is a really positive letter. It's part of the reason it's so good to look at the beginning of the year. It's a really encouraging letter. As Paul writes to this church and says, you know what? You guys are doing so good. You're doing so well. Keep doing it, and keep doing it more. That's the kind of purpose of the letter. And so I think he writes this kind of autobiographical section to say, let me remind you of what my ministry is so you can do the same thing among each other. So you know what to expect as you kind of do ministry, as you go on mission together. These are the things you want to be doing. These are the patterns of healthy ministry. And as it comes to us, we need to take this on board. We want to make sure that our ministries have a healthy shape to them. So for those of you who taught kids this morning, what does a healthy shape of ministry look like? Those of you at youth group on Friday night, leading a growth group for the first time this week, what will be the shape of your ministry together? As you meet up with each other in a park after church or during the week. What are you looking for? Is it success? Do you want applause? Do you want a life of just fun with all your friends? Or will we look to talk about Jesus? The gospel that there is one way to salvation, which excludes all others. Will we work hard? Will we love self-sacrificially? Will we live for the approval of God and not for each other? It might look like a failure. We'll get a bunch of things wrong. It may feel like a waste of time as well at points. But as we've seen here, what looks like a failure is actually the pattern of healthy ministry. Spencer Silver in 1968 was trying to develop a super strong glue. He failed dismally. What he came up with was this rubbish, stuff that just didn't stick very well to anything. He shared his problems with his colleague, whose name was Art Fry, which is a great name. Art Fry was having a problem. He was in a church choir, and he found it very difficult for his bookmarks to work in his hymn book, and so they kept falling out. And so what he did was stuck a bit of this rubbish glue onto his bookmarks and found that it really helped him in his church choir. Now, I'm not all interested in church choirs. I am interested in this multi-billion-dollar business. That is, what looked like a failure transformed a whole industry. I don't want to know how many millions of dollars my family spent on post-it notes, but it's a number of millions, I'm sure. What looks like a failure can actually be a great success, can actually be the pattern of health as we see this. As we hold out the word of Jesus. We're going to do that in a moment, actually. We're going to share together in the Lord's Supper And before we do that, what I'm going to get you to do, just to chat to each other, I gave you 4 things earlier that we thought about, the pattern of healthy ministry. Yeah? Speaking the gospel, suffering. Anyone? Anyone remember the third one? I know it's Sunday night. Seeking to please God, not ourselves, and serving. Why don't you just chat to the people around you? Is there one of those that has struck you in particular? I'll just give you 30 seconds, a minute to chat to the people around you. Say hello to them if you don't know them, and then I'll bring you back together and we'll share together in the Lord's Supper.